What's up guys, my name is Kale, and today on the King of Games we're going to be talking about something a little different today. 2024 has been a heck of a year for blaster releases, and this year we've got a lot of good ones and a lot of not so good ones. Everything from brand new lines from the mothership like the N1 line, to successors to previously popular blasters in the Pro category like the Nexus Pro X and the Aeon Pro X, and everything in between. Now, instead of talking about the straight-up worst blaster releases of 2024, I thought it'd be more interesting if we talked about the most disappointing releases. Releases that had a very high expectation, but in reality, they ended up not delivering. Let's get into it. So, like I said in the intro, these aren't necessarily the worst blaster releases, although some of them are particularly egregious. Some of them are also pretty decent blasters, they just had more hype than substance. The first release on this list, however, is definitely one of the worst releases of this year, and that is the Nerf Zombie Strikeout. In this case, the expectation is actually set by the line in general as opposed to the blaster itself. The fact that we're getting anything for a zombie line from Nerf in 2024 is rad. And it's something that calls back to the Zombie Strike line, which we got in the past. The print quality in this line is pretty cool, and it uses technology that we've seen popularized by X-Shot, but it's also something we've seen from Nerf before with their Ninja Turtles reskin, their Takedown reskin with Deadpool and Transformer bits, and a few others. Now this line features a melee weapon, which is known as the Strikeout. Now the reason I don't have one here to show you is because it is actually such an egregiously bad blaster that I don't feel comfortable giving Nerf my money even to review it for you guys. And I don't even mean to be dramatic when I say that. That's just genuinely how I feel. So what makes me feel so strong about this? Well, this blaster is both a melee weapon and a blaster. And because of it, it doesn't do either one particularly well, specifically with the melee side. In the lens of a blaster, it's not great because, well, it only takes 2 shots, it's not very powerful at under 70 FPS, and ergonomically, it's not great to aim or to prime. But there are plenty of single-shot low FPS blasters that are still fun to use. The Menace, the Jolt, and many others. What makes this blaster particularly bad is the melee side. You see, when you're making a blaster, generally you make it out of hard plastic, and that's not a problem because you don't hit people with it. But when you make a melee weapon in Nerf, since you're going to be hitting people, it needs to be covered entirely of foam. This is a good example of a melee weapon in Nerf. It has little to no plastic, and all of the plastic that it does contain is on the handle, not any of the striking area of the melee weapon. This entire thing is foam, so if I hit someone, although you should never go full force, if I did, it's very unlikely I'd be able to hurt them in any meaningful way. Now, the parts that are foam on this blaster are the blades of the saw sticking out of the bat. And there is a little bit other foam on the bat itself, but not much. The rest of this entire blaster is plastic. That means when you're striking somebody specifically intending to hit them with the foam, you're just 90 degrees away from knocking someone's tooth out. And being how quick Nerf is to mitigate potential lawsuits, you'd think this wouldn't have made it onto store shelves, but it did. And this isn't the first time Nerf has done something like this. They did have a Dungeons & Dragons tie-in, which was very similar in concept to this, but that one is, one, a prop, because it's Dungeons & Dragons tie-in, so I think it's targeted to a little bit older audience, and I can kinda see why they went that route. This one is clearly marketed to a younger audience. The second thing is that didn't come out this year, so even if I wanted to, I couldn't include it on this list. Either way, I think this particular melee weapon iteration is a total miss for them, and it sheds a bad light on the Nerf zombie line in general. Now let's move on to our next entry. Okay, so our next entry is actually a dual entry because both of these blasters are very similar, both in concept and in the reasons why they are disappointing for me personally. And that is going to be the Nightengale 2.0 and the Dart Zone Venom. Now, this is one of those cases where neither blaster is necessarily a bad blaster. In fact, they're both decent blasters that a lot of people kind of like. First, let's talk about the Nightengale 2.0. This blaster is basically a successor to the Nightengale 1.0.
Obviously.
It is a mag and grip pistol flywheeler that you can get in semi-auto or full auto. In the 2.0, it has metal rails included, which definitely makes it for a premium blaster. However, it also increases the price tag over the original. My issue really comes down to the form factor being just overly too chunky and much less slim than the original, and there being no real performance gains in this blaster. As a successor, you'd think that there would be improvements, but in reality, it costs more and I'd rather have the original, which makes this disappointing. I also think, as a side note, if you're gonna have a meat tenderizer in the front of your foam blaster weapon, maybe don't make it out of metal. Now, in parallel to that, we have another Nightengale mag-compatible blaster released this year by Dart Zone. This one is available only in full auto. Now, the pros of this blaster are that it sports the same mag geometry as the Nightengale. It's definitely cheaper, coming in at $50 US. It has a battery pack included with a charger, and it's sporting a brand new dart type, the Nitro Shot Plus darts. Now, I did do a complete review on the channel about this blaster, so if you want to know about it more in detail, then check out this video over here. But the TLDR is, what makes it disappointing is that despite the renders making it look more elongated and skinny, it's actually quite a chunky profile. It also has a clunky revving system, foregoing the dual stage of the Nightengale 1.0 and 2.0 for a squeeze to rev or backstrap rev placed on the back of the grip. Personally, I don't find the squeeze to rev placement very good because it's easy to trigger it when you didn't mean to and accidentally not trigger when you were trying to. But Dartzone has done it well on another blaster, the Maxim Pro, and I can give credit where credit's due for a good iteration over the poor iteration that's here. But also, the mechanism itself feels cheaper on the Venom Pro than it does on the Maxim. In addition to that, my personal unit actually died the very first game that I took it to.
Turn up the cover, push up, push up, push up. No way.
Tag him before the timer runs out!
And I actually had to use someone else's blaster that they let me borrow in order to finish my review on the blaster. I know that some of you guys probably really like this blaster, but for me it was very disappointing. My expectation of it was here, and it ended up delivering here. You could definitely remove that mechanism in lieu of a dual stage trigger by modding it yourself, but when the original Nightengale is only marginally more expensive than this blaster, I gotta wonder why you would. Now, the Venom was definitely a later release in the 2024 cycle, but I'd wanted to go all the way back to the beginning of the year for our next entry item. This is another situation where I'm actually going to be talking about two blasters in the same entry, and that is the entirety of 2024's options for the AccuRival line. You see, the first generation of AccuRival gave us three blasters: the Nerf Rival Fate, Vision, and Pathfinder. Despite personal preferences, I don't think any one of these blasters is a bad release. Fast forward to the second generation, and they released the Forerunner and the Pilot. And although I may not particularly like the Forerunner, I think both the Pilot and the Forerunner are good blasters. Fast forward to 2024, and we've got two more entries to this line. We've got this blaster right here, the Challenger, and we also have the Mirage. I do actually have a Mirage, but I seem to have misplaced it somewhere. That being said, even though these blasters came all the way out in January and it's now December, almost a year later, I still haven't released a review on them. Why? Because honestly, these are two blasters that I just didn't enjoy using so much that I kind of just moved on to other things. I was also in transition of moving at that time, so if it wasn't for that, I might have spent more time on them, but when having to choose what blasters to review with such little time, these ones just didn't make the cut. Both these blasters look like they were designed by a poorly trained AI. Things like the stringy nature of this design, which just really don't have a human element to it, but also weird decisions like having an oversized end strike lug, but with nothing to attach to the end strike lug, is exactly the type of decisions that an AI would make if it was designing a blaster. Now, personally, I'm not a fan of the implication that they use the AI design blasters at all. It kind of feels lazy, I guess, in my opinion, but I would have less qualms with it if the blaster itself was, well, good. Either of them. First off, we've got a very flimsy rail on top here. It is sporting Rival rail, which is fine, but once again, we still don't have any new attachments, so what's the point in the rail? The placement of things like this swiveling sling point probably don't really make sense, and the profile of this blaster is extremely tall but flat, making it kind of just clunky and awkward. Another thing about this blaster in particular is the curved magazine. It actually is backwards from the orientation of the Mirage, which means that the magazines aren't cross-compatible. Well, that this one isn't compatible with that one. It is compatible the other way around. But also, the cutout on the mag and grip for the Mirage is, like, genuinely a pain to use. Yes, I have, in fact, clipped my hand changing magazines. And that's ultimately disappointing, because the Mirage looks like a successor to the Apollo, and this blaster right here is what we're seeing for the first time. Basically a Strife in concept, but with rival ammo type. And that's actually a very exciting thing. Still, even with all that, the releases for this year under the AccuRival line are very disappointing, and I hope they don't continue this decline in 2025. Alright, I am going to kind of spoil this video a little bit by saying that I do pick on the mothership a lot in this video, so I want to take a little break from that to talk about a brand new company for this year, and that is the Siren Siren Blasters, 3 brand new entries into the pro category, all of them boasting over 150 FPS on short darts, which is very, very exciting. We get a mag-fed pistol, a mag-fed flywheeler, and a mag-fed pump-action springer, which is a pretty decent spread. Considering all of the innovations that these blasters brought to the table, I didn't expect to be so disappointed with them. And this disappointment comes not only from the blasters themselves, but just in the way the company has conducted themselves upon their entry into the hobby. Let's talk about the blasters. Of the 3, I didn't think that the best offering from these options was going to be the pistol, something that I'm usually not all that excited about. It was decently powerful and it was pretty reliable, so obviously that blaster's not on this list. The next blaster, the flywheeler, offers variable FPS, which is not something we've seen from many, if any, brushed flywheel blasters. It also has a very interesting charging system. It allows you to charge your lipos in the battery via USB-C, and that is something I have never seen before. The closest thing I've seen to that is the Strife X, which has its own enclosed battery that charges by USB-C, but you can't change the lipo that's inside it. With the Blink, you can, and that's a very exciting thing. It's also a bullpup, meaning the magazine is behind the grip, which is pretty exciting because it's far from the most common layout in the hobby. All 3 of the blasters have a sci-fi aesthetic and some ergonomic issues, but this one wasn't too bad, and definitely not as disappointing as their final entry. Their flagship blaster, the Mauler. This is the one that I think is the most disappointing offering that they gave us this year from their initial release. From reliability issues because the O-ring is sized improperly for the pusher, to the lack of rifling or ability to take rifling, to just a downright uncomfortable ergonomic profile. There's just so many things that this blaster got wrong that it's really disappointing because it offers a really cool and unique feature that I've also never seen in a pump action springer. And that's a hard wheel to reinvent because there's so many of them. And that feature is a movable catch. Now in this blaster, the further forward you place the catch, the more you shorten the prime stroke, which reduces FPS. And that is both an interesting way and a very unique way to take variable FPS for springers. But this blaster, like I said, doesn't have the ability to take any SCAR attachments, which at 200 FPS, it definitely needs. It also has a very uncomfortable and blocky grip and a tiny baby foregrip, which has a proprietary attachment point instead of a standard Picatinny, so you can't just easily change it out to something that's more comfortable and adult-sized. Whether it was intended to be upgraded or not, the hobby will definitely take care of some of these problems. However, that brings me to the second part of why this release is so disappointing. As a company, I think Siren failed to do 2 things. One, I think they failed to decide who these blasters were actually before they made them. And 2, I think they failed to show good faith in the community. Let me explain. So these blasters were all made for presale, meaning that they had a set future date that if you paid for them now, you'd get them at that future date. When that future date came, they were unable to fulfill those orders. And when they were able to fulfill orders, it was only partially. What people initially thought was the least desirable option, the pistol, was the only one that was available initially. They shipped these out as incomplete orders, promising to, for no extra charge, ship the other ones out when they were ready. And I can definitely appreciate that they didn't try to charge extra for shipping, even though they were incurring a greater cost to do so. I can also understand the possibility that they had production issues, and this being their first entry into the hobby, that they might run into some unexpected things as they were entering the final parts of their production, which would delay things. Like I said, totally forgivable. But in addition to that, they had some pretty aggressive marketing tactics that I thought were, I hate to say it like this, but kind of shady. They had rather aggressive NDAs for influencers, which they were partnering with to reveal the blasters, which allowed them to make changes to the videos before the influencers got to release, and that's something I've never been a fan of. It also kind of shows a lack of confidence in the product they were releasing. That being said, they also had a carpet bomb of ads from the creators using that creator's content. Now, the way that Facebook has this set up, there is an option for you to post as if you were the creator as long as you have the creator's permission. Did have permission to use it, but then the way that they used it was in this really aggressive carpet bomb ad situation where it was so bad that I actually got about 14 ads in a 2-hour window on Facebook.
That don't make no sense.
They edited it in a way that wasn't true to any of the creators' content, and it just really rubbed me in the wrong way. That being said, I don't have any ill will per se towards Siren, and I actually really hope that they succeed in 2025 and beyond. They had some really innovative designs, and I think if they had led with those and been a little more open to criticism, I think things would have gone differently for them this year. I do hope that they learn from this, and I hope to see them return with innovative ideas in 2025. Alright, speaking of Pro Blasters, let's talk about the next entry on our list. This is the Nerf Pro Sender, and it is one of 2 blasters that were released this year under the Nerf Pro line. The other blaster being the Torrent. Along with the Strife X, these are the only 3 foam blasters that Nerf has released under their Pro line. The rest of the Pro line has been gel. I was excited to see that even though the amount of white in the color scheme had changed, the color scheme overall of the Pro line remained the same. We got gray, white, and orange, and I thought these new translucent mags looked pretty cool. Unfortunately for this particular blaster, that's where the hype ends. When we actually got these blasters in our hands, there was a litany of things that I didn't like about them. First, the mags are proprietary. Now they do, for the most part, match the Worker Talon angled mags, but they have a proprietary lip they hold less darts, and the tolerances between this and the blaster they were designed for is not great. Combine that with some misaligned flywheels right out the gate for a majority of people, a placement of a useless rival rail when we don't get any rival accessories in the modern era, and couple that with the fact that this blaster overall is in a very awkward size placement, both too small to be a good and comfortable primary, and too large to be a sidearm, I just found this to overall be a disappointing release this year. Now, this is only their second flywheeler in the Pro category, but they did not continue the LiPo technology that they started with the Strife X, instead opting for AA batteries, which, I mean, is cool because of accessibility, and I don't hate it, but it also makes it kind of like heavy and in a weird spot. They also kind of copped out, in my opinion, by including a cover for this and not an actual stock to go along with it. The Torrent and the Sender both have these cover pieces instead of actual stocks, and neither of them are compatible with each other. This mag is not compatible with any other blaster that takes angle talon mags, though actual angle talon mags do fit in here, and for some reason they fit better than these do.
What?
Unfortunately, angle talon mags don't work particularly well in this either. These ridges are meant to stop the mag from going too high, and angle talon mags don't have that, so there isn't any mag that works great in this. I think just lacking the general accuracy and compatibility of the previous generation of the Nerf Pro line makes this release disappointing. Notice that I'm talking about this blaster in specific and not including the Torrent with it. I do plan to review both this blaster and the Torrent in the future, and I'll go more into detail why, but I think that the Torrent is a much better blaster than this one, and for that reason, the Torrent actually didn't get on this list, and this one did. Now, the next disappointing blaster release is actually going to be the Stinger V1. This blaster is a prime example of a blaster that overall is still pretty darn good, but the hype versus the delivery really left a lot to be desired. First, we'll talk about why it was so hyped, and then we'll talk about how it didn't deliver. Now, the promise of this blaster is that it would be better than the Momentum by Eli Wu was, but at a better price point. And that is a tall order. We're talking about a flywheeler that's dual stage, brushless, variable FPS, select fire, pretty much the pinnacle of flywheeler technology. But that blaster is very expensive. I've also found that it was more accurate than your traditional flywheeler. One of the things that tends to lean people more towards springers over flywheelers is accuracy. So that's definitely a big selling point for the blaster. Now, let's talk about what's good about the Stinger V1. It does in fact deliver a brushless flywheeler, dual stage, select fire. It does offer a very high rate of fire, and it does offer some smart functionality like the Momentum. Now, you could argue that it was on par with Momentum, although I'm not sure I agree with that, but it's definitely not better than Momentum at all of those things, which is the promise the creator was offering with the platform. There's also a few additional drawbacks in my opinion. First is the exposed flywheels. That is kind of a safety concern in my opinion, and I'm definitely not picking on this blaster alone for having that. There are other blasters that have that, and every time I've seen that, I've always thought that that was not a great idea. When you have really fast spinning flywheels, and you're supposed to put them next to your face, beard hair, long hair, arguably fingers and debris can get caught in there very easily. That's why most designs have them covered. Another known issue with this blaster is the ribbon cable for the display. It is a flip-out display, which I thought was a very cool idea. However, having the ribbon cable break pretty much eliminates your ability to use the display. And innovation is all good and well, as long as it actually works. One other thing I wasn't particularly a fan of is the aesthetics. I think with a blaster like Momentum, aesthetics are a big part of the blaster. And with the Stinger V1, there are these two bars that run on either side, clamping the blaster design together, which the designer claims is for rigidity, and I don't doubt that. Springers, which take much higher forces, usually have these kinds of designs when it comes to 3D printed blasters. However, the fashion that they're joined with the 16 screws, which are exposed, and then the very flat design, makes the blaster look like it's incomplete. Now, the good news is that it looks incomplete because it is incomplete. This month we got a video on the creator's YouTube channel announcing the Stinger V2, promising improvements over the original. Improvements to the ribbon cable for the display, changing the exterior of the bars to look like a more finished product with cutouts, and even though the flywheels are still exposed, it is a lot less of them that is exposed. So I'm definitely happy to see that. On the flip side of that, I'm pretty sure what he said was that there was going to be a price increase for the Stinger. So even if it does manage to make good on the first half of its promise, and bridge the gap between itself and the Momentum, if it takes a price increase to do it, then it fails the second half of its promise, which is to be significantly cheaper than the Momentum. In all honesty though, brushless flywheelers are expensive to make, so it doesn't bother me that the price point is going to be higher. What makes it disappointing is that it can't deliver on the promise that it made. Without those promises, the release on its own stands as a very, very promising platform, and I really hope to see it succeed in future iterations. I also think it's extremely impressive that, to my knowledge, this is that creator's first blaster release. So going from 0 blaster designs to one of the most complicated and technologically advanced platform categories is still extremely impressive. And considering how young the creator is, I think we could see many more designs from them. Now on to our final disappointing blaster release of 2024. And that release is the entirety of the N1 line, with one exception. Now, if you've been watching my channel for a while, it's probably no surprise to you that I'm not particularly fond of the N1 line. I mean, I haven't covered a single blaster on the channel that is from it, despite how many there are. That being said, the reasons why I find it disappointing may not be the ones that you were thinking. As for the ammo type, that's actually not really the reason I'm disappointed with these releases. Although it is a new proprietary type, that's something that Nerf does every so often. I mean, look at Ultra and Rival when it came out, and Mega, and so on and so forth. Other companies generally tend to adapt if the platform is good enough to survive. And based on what I've seen and tested with the darts themselves, it is in fact better, like they are claiming, than Elite darts. And I don't personally share the same sentimental value with Elite darts that a lot of the community does. Now, I will say, like most Nerf ammos, they are extremely expensive for what they are, but at the end of the day, my issue actually lies with the blaster themselves. Like, the whole line as a concept. It's really giving Elite 2.0 vibes. While most likely the reason Elite 2.0 had solvent welds and other things that might have felt malicious to community probably was out of cost cutting and not a genuine maliciousness towards the aftermarket, it still felt like it was malicious towards the aftermarket. And N1 gives off that same vibe. And there is one particular example of a feature that gives those vibes especially, and that is this thing right here. I actually was really excited to grab this particular blaster. It wasn't really for the blaster itself, it was more of the accessories that came with it. I thought the front end would make for a good integration, and I thought that the stock that came with it would be perfect for some of the new Nerf Pro blasters, particularly the Sender's awkward length, and most stocks are too long for the awkward length of the Sender. And when I took off the stock of this blaster to use it on another blaster, I found one of the most disappointing things I think I've seen in a while, and that is an end strike attachment point that is incompatible with other end strike attachment points. Let me explain. This is the male end of an end strike stock attachment. On the bottom, you have ridges right here for teeth that are located on the stock themselves to clip onto. This is what allows the stock to be retained. Like, yes, it'll fit on there, but what stops it from falling off? These teeth right here. And in most Nerf blasters, there's one tooth on the stock, but in aftermarket options like a stock from Worker, there's actually two. On this blaster, instead of being located on the bottom, the teeth are located on the top, which means it can't be retained to any other end strike attachment point except for that one.
Huh?
In this design, I can't think of a single cost-cutting measure that can explain away what feels like a very malicious move to compatibility. That being said, the exception to the N1 line is the Sprinter. The Sprinter is my favorite blaster in the N1 line by far. Even though I don't own one, I've seen them, I like the profile, but it does look really good. And actually, if I could, I would have traded the Sprinter into the Pro line with half-dart compatibility over the Sender, and honestly, even over the Torrent, which, like I said earlier, was the better of the two options for this year. Now, if there are any entries on this list that you disagree with, let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. If there's any entries that you thought were more disappointing than the ones that I put on this list, I'd also like to hear about those. I am also going to be doing a best releases of 2024 video next, so make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell so you don't miss when that video comes out. But that's pretty much all I have for you today, and until next time on the King of Games, have a blast.